He showed up thinking it was just another interview. But when the judge brought up Denzel's father's criminal record on live television, something in the room changed. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just told one story, one true story, that made the audience question everything about justice, truth, and who really holds power. What did Denzel know that nobody else did? And how did 30 seconds destroy a man's entire career? The studio lights were hot and blinding, casting a polished glow across the high-gloss floor of the primetime TV set. It was a special legal edition of the country's most-watched evening talk show, and tonight's panel was meant to draw ratings and headlines. At the center of the stage, seated in plush black chairs, were two sharply contrasting figures. On one side sat Judge Ronald Merrow, a towering, silver-haired figure known not just for his courtroom decisions but for his combative on-air personality. He'd built his reputation on being no-nonsense, brutal with his rulings, and unafraid to say what others were too weak to say. On the other side, dressed in a dark navy suit and a quiet smile, sat Denzel Washington. He was not there to promote a film. Not tonight. The producers had invited him to speak as a guest of honor, part of a special segment on justice and race in America. But no one expected what would follow. Judge Merrow had already begun establishing his dominance the moment the cameras started rolling. He smirked as he leaned forward to speak, using legal terms the average viewer wouldn't recognize, clearly enjoying the attention. He referred to Denzel as Mr. Actor, subtly dismissing his insights on systemic injustice. At first, Denzel offered polite responses. He spoke carefully, giving brief, thoughtful answers while others filled the air with noise. But viewers at home could sense it. The tension was building, second by second. Judge Merrow kept circling the same topic, that celebrities should stay out of legal matters they don't understand. Then came the first jab. With a self-satisfied grin, Merrow leaned in and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Washington, what qualifies you to sit on this stage and discuss the complexities of law enforcement or the judicial system? Last I checked, reciting lines and living in Hollywood doesn't give you insight into how real people live or how justice really works." Denzel didn't flinch. He let the silence hang for just a beat longer than expected. The audience in the studio murmured. Some turned toward Denzel to see how he'd react. He gave a calm, measured nod, adjusted the microphone, and replied, "Maybe not, Judge. But I grew up watching justice fail the man who raised me." The words landed heavy. Merrow's brow twitched. The host, sensing something had shifted, moved quickly to another pane list, but the moment had already cracked open the show's polished exterior. Backstage, producers began exchanging glances. Denzel's team remained still, their hands folded, waiting. Merrow, clearly irritated that his authority had been undercut, tried again, this time with more aggression. "Look," he said, chuckling, "I'm sure you've played a few lawyers, maybe a soldier or two, but let's be honest. These topics aren't for actors looking to make a scene." It was subtle, but Denzel's eyes narrowed just slightly. He wasn't here to make a scene, but if the judge wanted one, he was about to get it. The live audience felt it, a charged electricity in the air. The host, visibly uncomfortable now, attempted to pivot the conversation toward safer ground, but Merrow refused to let go. He brought up current crime rates, evoked stereotypes, and veered dangerously close to dog whistles. Then he mentioned Denzel's father. "You speak a lot about justice," Merrow said, "but weren't there complications in your own family history with the law? Your father, wasn't he incarcerated at one point? I imagine that must have shaped your views, understandably so." That was the moment the air left the room. The crowd, the viewers at home, even the crew behind the cameras, everyone froze. There were lines you didn't cross on live television. This was one of them. Denzel didn't speak right away. He looked down for a brief moment, a hand resting lightly on the arm of his chair. He wasn't rattled. He was remembering something. And when he looked back up, his voice didn't rise. It dropped, just enough to draw everyone closer. "I'm glad you brought that up," he said quietly, "because what happened to my father is the reason I'm here tonight." His tone didn't threaten. It didn't challenge. It promised. Something was coming, and now no one could look away. Judge Merrow blinked, surprised by the calm. He had expected anger. But Denzel was calm. Too calm. The audience, the producers, even the judge himself began to sense it. Something was about to unfold that would change the entire tone of the night. And Denzel hadn't even raised his voice yet. Years before Denzel Washington was a household name, before the red carpets and standing ovations, he was a boy sitting outside a courtroom, waiting for news that would shape the rest of his life. He was 13 when his father was taken away. Not for something violent, not for something proven. A robbery at a local store had gone wrong. No one was hurt, but someone needed to be blamed, and Denzel's father, Arthur Washington, a quiet janitor with no record, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd stopped in to buy aspirin for his wife's headaches. He didn't know the clerk had just called the police. The suspect had already run. But Arthur fit the vague description. Black male, over 6 feet, wearing work boots. That was enough. He was arrested without question. Within 2 months, he was tried and sentenced. The court-appointed lawyer never asked for camera footage. No fingerprints were tested. The witnesses were nervous, unsure, but said he looked like the guy. That was all the jury needed. Denzel sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, too young to understand the cold way justice worked. But he never forgot the way his mother cried on the steps after the verdict. They were good people. They kept to themselves. His father worked 2 jobs. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that a system needed someone to blame, and it didn't care if it got it wrong. Arthur served 5 years. By the time he got out, everything had changed. He was never the same. He rarely spoke, rarely smiled. He died 10 years later from a heart attack Denzel always believed was caused more by grief than health. That pain never left. Denzel built his career on stories and characters, but he never told the story of his father. Not on stage. Not in interviews. Not even to close friends. But he never forgot. And he never forgave. So when the producers called and said they were assembling a special panel on race, justice, and the modern legal system, Denzel said yes without hesitation. He didn't tell his publicist why. He didn't tell the show's host why. But he asked one quiet favor: make sure Judge Ronald Merrow is there. The producers were thrilled. A high-profile guest, a controversial judge, a potential debate, it was perfect television. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't a debate to Denzel. This was something he had been preparing for since he was 13 years old. In the days leading up to the taping, Denzel did more than rehearse lines. He visited the old courthouse in his hometown. He met with the son of his father's public defender, who kept boxes of his father's old case notes. Denzel read every page. He re-watched archived footage of Judge Merrow's most notorious cases. He studied patterns, rulings, dismissals. He marked the moments Merrow sided against men who looked like Arthur. He memorized them. Not to argue. To reveal. Quietly. Calmly. With truth. Denzel had no intention of shouting. He didn't want to humiliate anyone. He wanted one thing: to make the judge, and every viewer watching, feel what he felt sitting in that courtroom as a boy. Not rage. Not vengeance. Just the quiet weight of truth. So he sat in the makeup chair before the taping, thinking not about what he would say, but about what he wouldn't. He would not speak for applause. He would not perform. He would speak because it was time. He knew Judge Merrow's type. Men who built their careers on sounding smart and looking unbothered. Men who saw compassion as weakness and cruelty as justice. He'd seen their work in prisons, in courtrooms, in lives shattered like his father's. That's why Denzel was there, not as a celebrity, not as an actor, but as a witness. And witnesses, he believed, had a duty to speak. As the cameras rolled and Merrow started throwing punches masked as questions, Denzel remained still. He didn't strike back because he wasn't there to win. He was there to reveal. To slowly guide the conversation toward the story no one knew he was carrying. And when the judge mentioned his father, Denzel felt everything inside him fall silent. Not anger. Not fear. But purpose. The audience didn't know what was coming. The host didn't know. Even Merrow didn't realize what he'd just triggered. But Denzel knew. He'd waited years for that moment. And it wasn't going to be a moment of rage. It was going to be a moment of reckoning. Not for ratings. Not for revenge. For truth. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, but breaks everything apart just by being spoken aloud. The tension in the studio had been slowly climbing, like a string being pulled tighter with each passing moment. The audience could feel it. The host could feel it. The producers watching from the control room started leaning forward in their chairs. The discussion had drifted from policies and law enforcement trends to personal experience, and that's when Judge Merrow, perhaps sensing he was losing control of the conversation, took a calculated risk. His voice, sharp and smooth like the tip of a blade, cut through the air as he looked directly at Denzel and said, "With all this talk about systemic failure and bias, I think the viewers would be interested to know that your own father was no stranger to the justice system." There was no warning. No build-up. Just that single sentence dropped like a stone into a still lake. The air in the room changed. There was a hush, not the respectful kind, but the kind that follows a slap across the face. Denzel didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the judge, his hands calmly resting on his lap. He didn't speak. Not yet. The host blinked hard, clearly thrown off, and looked toward the producers for direction, but they were frozen too. No one had expected that. Merrow, sensing the weight of what he'd just said, smiled ever so slightly. He leaned back in his chair as if waiting for Denzel to either explode or fold. Denzel did neither. He simply adjusted the mic in front of him, took a breath, and said nothing. The silence dragged on, heavy and suffocating. Merrow, expecting some sort of outrage, cleared his throat and added, "I only bring it up because these conversations should be honest. And honestly, I think it's important to acknowledge when someone's views might be shaped more by pain than objectivity." He smiled as if he were being reasonable. As if dragging a man's dead father into the public spotlight was just part of the debate. But everyone watching knew, it wasn't a point. It was an attack. Backstage, Denzel's team was motionless. One of the assistants whispered, "Did he really just say that?" But no one responded. In the booth, the show's editor signaled to be ready for a commercial break, but the director shook his head. They knew something was happening. Something real. And you don't cut away from real. Denzel leaned forward slightly, finally breaking his stillness. But instead of addressing the insult, he looked at the audience and began telling a story. Not about his father's arrest. Not about the trial. But about the night it happened. He described coming home from school, finding the house empty except for his mother sitting at the kitchen table, hands trembling, unable to speak. He remembered her face when she finally looked up and said, "They took him." He remembered standing in that doorway for what felt like an hour, staring at a life that had just split in half. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He painted a picture so vivid that even the studio lights seemed to dim. Then he turned back to the judge. "You brought up my father's record," Denzel said, voice calm. "Let me tell you what's not in that record. It won't tell you that he never missed a day of work before that. It won't tell you he used to give his lunch to the homeless guy who slept behind the bus station. It won't tell you that after he got out, he never blamed anyone. Not once. He just went back to cleaning schools because he believed in keeping things clean, even when the world treated him like dirt." The judge shifted uncomfortably. The audience was dead silent. You could hear someone in the back row exhale too loudly and catch themselves. Denzel wasn't just talking anymore. He was taking back the story. Reclaiming it from the hands of a man who thought throwing out a criminal record on live TV would be a knockout punch. But this wasn't a fight. This was something else. Something quieter. More dangerous. Then Denzel said something that made the entire room freeze. "You say I see the world through pain. Maybe. But I'd rather see the truth through pain than through pride." The words were soft. Not angry. But they hit harder than any insult. Judge Merrow blinked, caught off guard by the reversal. He had expected emotion. What he got was control. Precision. Power. A woman in the front row nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. Someone in the control room whispered, "This isn't just a segment anymore." And they were right. It was no longer a panel. It was no longer entertainment. It was something real, something raw, something viewers at home would talk about for days. And Judge Merrow had just become the villain of his own show. But Denzel wasn't done. Not yet. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't looked for applause. He had simply pulled a thread. A small one. But as everyone watched, they realized that thread ran straight through Judge Merrow's spotless robe. And it was beginning to unravel. Denzel didn't blink as the words left the judge's mouth. He sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, but behind his eyes there was a storm building, steady, slow, and undeniable. The judge had tried to break him by throwing his father's record into the spotlight, hoping to rattle him or silence him. But what Judge Merrow didn't realize was that Denzel had spent a lifetime preparing for this exact moment. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to argue. He needed only to speak plainly, with the kind of truth that could not be touched, spun, or undone. The host tried to intervene. "Let's steer this back toward the policy side of things," he said nervously, eyeing the teleprompter, trying to move away from what was quickly becoming too raw for live TV. But the audience wasn't ready to move on. The silence in the studio was thick. All eyes were locked on Denzel, waiting. Even Judge Merrow had stopped his smug shifting in his seat. He was still now, his fingers fidgeting just slightly at the edge of his chair's armrest. He had felt the shift too. Something had changed. This was no longer a discussion. It was something heavier. Denzel leaned forward, his voice soft and steady. "You want to talk about justice," he said. "Let's talk about your courtroom." The host froze. Merrow straightened up, his eyes narrowing. Denzel didn't flinch. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and laid it gently on the table between them. "In the last 7 years, you've overseen 312 criminal cases. Out of those, 87% of defendants were Black or Latino. And of those cases, 62 were overturned due to judicial error or appeals. That's nearly 20%, Judge. And most of those reversals. They came from higher courts citing racial bias in jury selection, sentencing, and admissibility of evidence." The audience gasped. Merrow opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Denzel continued. "I spoke to one of the public defenders from your district. He said your courtroom is nicknamed the funnel, because that's where poor defendants get pushed through without real trials. Fast, clean, quiet. Like a machine." The judge turned red, his lips twitching, but he stayed quiet. He had nothing prepared for this. No comeback for facts. No defense against receipts. Denzel's voice stayed calm. "I didn't come here to argue. I came here to listen. But when you brought up my father, you made it clear that this isn't just a conversation for you. It's personal. So now it's personal for me too." The camera zoomed in slowly, capturing the tension on Merrow's face. His eyes darted, first to the host, then to the audience, then back to Denzel. He looked like a man who had misread the room, who'd brought a sword to a war he thought he would win without a fight, only to realize the man across from him didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. Denzel reached into his other pocket and held up a small laminated photo. It was old, edges worn, colors faded. "This is my father on the day he was released. No cameras. No press. Just a man who lost 5 years to a system that didn't care about truth. That record you mentioned doesn't say he was innocent. It doesn't say he was a church deacon. It doesn't say he coached Little League. It doesn't say he cried the first time he held his grandson. That record tells you what the system wanted you to believe. But here's the thing, Judge, people are more than their records." The audience was dead silent. No phones rang. No coughs. Nothing. Just the sound of one man slowly dismantling another without raising his voice. Denzel placed the photo on the table beside the paper and looked at Merrow with something that wasn't anger. It was pity. "You're not a bad man, Judge," he said quietly. "But you are a man who stopped looking. You stopped listening. And when people stop listening, they stop seeing. You don't see my father. You don't see the men who've stood in front of your bench. You just see numbers. Names. Files. And you decide who matters and who doesn't." Judge Merrow tried to interject, but the host lifted his hand without a word. Even he knew now was not the time to speak. The audience was locked in, some with jaws slightly open, others nodding slowly, stunned at what they were witnessing. Denzel sat back, his voice calm to the end. You brought me here thinking I'd be a nice story, a famous face for your program. But I came here to say one thing. Truth isn't afraid of being questioned. Power is. And I think you've confused the two for a long time. The studio was quiet for a full 5 seconds after Denzel finished. 5 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. Until the entire audience stood on their feet. Not because Denzel had shouted them into applause, but because he had spoken a kind of truth that people rarely hear on camera. Judge Merrow sat frozen, lips pressed tight, eyes glazed with something between shame and disbelief. Denzel didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply looked down at his father's photo one more time, then folded the paper, slid it back into his jacket, and waited. Not for praise. Not for thanks. Just for the silence to settle. Just when the air seemed like it couldn't get any heavier, it did. The applause from the audience had faded into an uneasy quiet, a silence so thick you could feel it in your chest. Denzel sat still, his face calm, while Judge Merrow finally looked like a man who realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. His smirk was gone. His eyes, darting across the studio, weren't looking for someone to blame, they were searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. In the control room above, one of the assistant producers stood frozen with her headphones half on, her other hand over her mouth. She had just gotten a message from a junior editor who had been monitoring social media in real time. There's a video. It's going viral, like now, the editor whispered through her headset. It's him. The judge. You need to see this. A link popped up on the screen. She clicked it. And within seconds, the blood drained from her face. Back on stage, the host was just about to throw the segment to a commercial break when the producer's voice shouted through his earpiece. Hold. We need to show something. Now. The host looked confused but nodded. Okay, folks, he said with a nervous smile. We're going to shift for a moment. Our team has just received a breaking clip that surfaced online, and with respect to the discussion we're having, we think it's important to share. Viewer discretion is advised. The giant screen behind the panel lit up, and the studio lights dimmed slightly as the footage played. The video was grainy but clear enough. It showed Judge Merrow in what looked like his private chambers. The setting was a few months old, based on the court docket displayed on the desk. He was sitting in a leather chair, speaking to 2 other men, presumably clerks or colleagues, unaware that one of them was recording. His voice was unmistakable. These kids come in here thinking they can outsmart the system, he said. But they're not thinkers. They're products. Broken homes, no fathers, no discipline. You put a suit on a stray dog, it's still a stray dog. He laughed. Especially the young black ones, they're all bark, no future. It's sad, really. But we know how this works. You give 'em 10 years, they either come out quiet or don't come out at all. Gasps filled the studio like a wave. Some people covered their mouths. Others shook their heads. A woman in the 3rd row stood up and walked out, visibly shaking. The host turned pale, clearly caught off guard. Judge Merrow sat frozen, his face blank, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The video kept playing. They always cry racism, Merrow continued on the recording, but I treat everyone the same. I just happen to believe that if you burn your life to the ground, the system shouldn't be expected to build it back up for you. That's not racism. That's responsibility. The video ended. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Even Denzel remained still, as if letting the moment breathe. Merrow finally reached for his mic, his voice cracking. That clip was taken without my consent. I don't recall saying those exact. Denzel turned to him, his tone still calm but cutting. You don't recall saying it. But you didn't deny it, either. Merrow opened his mouth again, then closed it. The audience waited, but it was clear he had no defense. Not now. Not with the world watching. The host leaned forward, clearly shaken. We just want to note that this video has not yet been verified by an independent source, but it is now circulating widely online. We've received confirmation from multiple news outlets that it's trending nationally. Judge Merrow, do you want to respond? Merrow tried to speak, but every word he started fell apart. He looked like a man drowning in full view of the public. This is a setup, he said finally. It's a smear campaign. Someone's trying to ruin my name. Denzel leaned forward, his voice low. Your name isn't being ruined. It's being revealed. There was no applause this time. No cheers. Just the cold weight of reality pressing down on the entire studio. The truth didn't need a standing ovation. It had already done its job. In the control room, the team began preparing for crisis coverage. Lawyers were already calling. The station's legal team was scrambling to draft statements. On social media, the video had already been clipped, subtitled, and reposted by major accounts. Headlines popped up in real time. Federal judge caught making racist remarks. Live TV meltdown ends in career suicide. Denzel Washington exposes truth without saying a word. Judge Merrow, once known for being sharp, confident, and untouchable, now looked small under the lights. His hands trembled. His eyes darted. The host tried to bring the show to a close, but the moment couldn't be wrapped up with words. Everyone knew they had just watched a man's career collapse in 30 seconds. Denzel didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He looked at the judge for one long moment, not with anger, but with something deeper. Disappointment. Then he stood up, adjusted his jacket, and turned toward the exit. He had come for a conversation, but the truth had spoken louder than anything he could say. And all it took was one clip. The taping ended in a strange kind of silence, the kind that felt more like the closing of a chapter than the end of a show. The usual buzz that followed high-profile interviews was absent. Crew members moved slowly, some too stunned to speak. The host sat slumped in his chair, earpiece hanging loose, eyes distant. No wrap-up lines, no promotional smiles, no one-liners to send the audience off. The crowd had already started to clear out, some in groups whispering urgently, others moving alone, still processing what they'd witnessed. But everyone knew they hadn't just watched another TV segment. They had witnessed a turning point, something raw, powerful, and irreversible. Judge Ronald Merrow didn't leave right away. He remained in his seat for a full 5 minutes after the cameras cut, staring at nothing in particular. His expression was hollow. The makeup on his face had started to crack, revealing the sweat underneath. His hands were still gripping the arms of the chair, though now they trembled. 2 security staff came quietly to escort him backstage, not because he was a threat to anyone, but because the public had become a threat to him. In just under an hour, his name had gone from one of respect to one trending alongside disgrace. On the walk back, he asked no questions and gave no answers. For once in his career, Merrow had nothing to say. Denzel, on the other hand, exited the set with the same quiet calm that he had entered with. He didn't stay to greet the crew. He didn't take a victory lap. A junior producer asked him if he wanted to offer a statement, maybe clarify something for the network's website. He shook his head. There's nothing left to clarify, he said softly. Then he walked out of the building and disappeared into a black SUV waiting quietly by the curb. The internet, of course, did not stay quiet. The leaked clip exploded across every major platform. In less than 3 hours, it had been viewed over 5 million times. By morning, it would double that. Hashtags like #MerrowResign and #DenzelTellsTheTruth were trending worldwide. Opinion pieces flooded in from every direction, some praising Denzel for his restraint and courage, others calling for investigations into Merrow's past cases. Legal groups began reviewing old verdicts. Civil rights attorneys started pulling transcripts. Protesters gathered outside Merrow's courthouse before sunrise with signs that read not just one judge and truth isn't defamation. But through all of this, Denzel stayed silent. He turned down every interview request. He didn't post a statement online. He didn't show up at press events or morning shows. His publicist released a single line on his behalf: "Some things are better heard once than explained twice." It was a sentence that said everything and nothing all at once. The people closest to him knew the silence was not about shyness. It was about peace. Denzel had carried his father's story for decades, waiting for the right moment to release it into the world. Not to get even. Not to make headlines. But to make it mean something. And now that it had been told, there was nothing more to say. Late that night, far away from cameras and crowds, Denzel visited a quiet cemetery outside the city. He walked through the moonlit grass, hands in his coat pockets, until he found the small headstone that read Arthur Washington, beloved father, always watching. He stood there for a long time, saying nothing at first. Just breathing. Just remembering. Then he crouched down, placed the same worn photo from the studio gently at the base of the stone, and whispered a few words only he would ever hear. There were no speeches. No dramatic pauses. Just a son giving back the truth that had once been stolen. As he stood to leave, he paused. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees. For a moment, he looked back toward the stone and gave the faintest smile. Not one of joy, but of release. A weight had been lifted, not just from him, but from something larger. A system that had hidden too much for too long had just had a light shine straight through its cracks. The next morning, Judge Merrow announced an immediate leave of absence. By the end of the week, he had been placed under formal investigation. The courts reopened several of his past rulings. The panel show was re-aired with a disclaimer and drew one of the highest rerun ratings in network history. But Denzel didn't watch it. He was already back to work, back on set, back telling stories that reached people in different ways. Yet the world knew, this one, the one he didn't play a role in but lived through, would be remembered forever. Not because he raised his voice, but because he chose not to.